Hey, everybody, it's Mike Portnoy here, and I'm here to talk about my top 11 drummers. This show goes to 11. Coming in at number one. Now, this is in no order of their impact. This is in chronological order of when they appeared in my life and in my ears and when they influenced me. But even though this is chronological, this first one really is kind of number one in my book because the Beatles are my favorite band of all time. And Ringo Starr obviously was a huge, important drummer in my life. From the day I was born about 6 weeks before Sgt. Pepper came out. In fact, the Beatles finished their last session for Sgt. Pepper the day I was born. So yeah, literally from day one in my life, the Beatles were there, and Ringo was so important to them. I mean, he's so underrated. People don't realize the Beatles would not have made the music they made without him. He was so important to the recording process and everything the Beatles did and everything Ringo did was the first to be done. And for that reason alone, he has to be the first one on this list. Number two, chronologically for me, started out with the Beatles, but shortly after I was introduced to The Who, and Keith Moon had a huge impact on me. He played the drums like a lead instrument. He was the first drummer I ever heard that played the drums that way, like a lead instrument. And then throughout my childhood, we could only listen to these records. We didn't have, Blu-rays and DVDs and streaming internet like we do nowadays. So, you could only hear these drummers and picture in your head what they were like. But in 1979, fast forward a bit to 79, and the movie The Kids Are All Right came out. And for me, seeing Keith on the big screen, that was like my Ed Sullivan moment. Everyone talks about the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. Well, me seeing Keith Moon on the big screen and The Kids Are All Right, that was like, I couldn't take my eyes off him. I was mesmerized, and I realized at that moment, that's the type of drummer I want to be. He was just completely animated. Couldn't take your eyes off him, just playing the drums like a lead instrument, and blew my mind, and he became one of my biggest heroes of all time. Number three, and I can't understate how important this guy is, not only to me, but to so many drummers around the world. John Bonham. He was just a game changer. He was, and still is to this day, considered one of the greatest of all time. His career span was so short. Really, we only had from 68 to 80. We only had 12 years with him. To think of what could have come, all those years later, but sadly we lost him at such a young age. So his discography is very limited, but it's so impactful. From the very beginning of Good Times, Bad Times on the very first album to the very end with, In Through the Outdoor, everything he did just had so much taste and power and finesse. I mean, he hit the drums like a lumberjack, with so much power, but at the same time, he had so much finesse. He could play, like the Fool in the Rain shuffle. His sense of musicality, he played the drums so musically. All those great drum intros, When the Levee Breaks and Rock and Roll and the Rover and the Crunge, he had so many completely identifiable drum parts, and to this day he's still one of the greatest of all time. Coming in at number four, probably the person on this list that had the greatest impact on me altogether. I mean, all of these guys have, but this next one probably was the most important drummer in my career and my development as a drummer, and of course it's Neil Peart. Once I was a teenager, once I was around 13 or 14, I wanted to have the bigger kit. I wanted to play more challenging music. And that's when I discovered Neil Peart and Rush's music. And it just turned my world upside down. He was my introduction to odd time signatures and really cool, creative musical drumming. the big giant drum kit. I mean, I used to stare at Modern Drummer magazine. The other kids were staring at Playboy magazines. I was looking at, Modern Drummer centerfolds and studying the drum kits and stuff like that. And Neil just had such a tremendous impact on me at that point of my life. And I just became obsessed, literally learning all of his drum parts, all the Rush albums inside and out. Reading the transcriptions. I learned how to start reading drum transcriptions from reading all the Neil stuff, the Neil Peart transcription books. One of the greatest of all time, influenced millions and millions of drummers around the world. But I was definitely one of them. And later on in his life, he and I became friends, which was, one of the greatest honors of my life to have that relationship with him. All right, number 5, chronologically, I just mentioned Neil Peart and progressive music, my introduction to progressive music. Once I started going down that rabbit hole, this next drummer had a huge, huge impact on me, and that would be Bill Bruford. I discovered Bill Bruford, obviously, with Yes. I started listening to Fragile and Close to the Edge. But then, once I started learning about Bill, I went deeper into his discography. And I mean, if there's any guy in prog music that is like the prog father, it's him, because obviously he has his stuff with Yes, but then he went to join King Crimson, and he's got this incredible discography with King Crimson. The early stuff like, Lark's Tongue and Aspic and Red, and then he was also part of the 80s incarnation, which did Discipline and Beat, Three of a Perfect Pair, and even stayed with King Crimson into the 90s, into the 2000s with, double drumming and stuff. So yeah, his stuff with Yes, his stuff with King Crimson. He then he toured with Genesis on their first tour when Phil Collins stepped up to the microphone. The stuff with UK, the first UK album, and then also his solo stuff. He had this incredible band with Alan Holdsworth and Jeff Berlin doing more like jazz fusion stuff. So yeah, Bill Bruford's impact on me going down the prog rabbit hole was huge. Number 6 is another prog drummer. At this point in my life when I was a mid-teen, and I went down this prog rabbit hole, and there was Neil Peart and there was Bill Bruford, but then there was also this next guy, Terry Bozzio. After the first UK album, Bruford and Holdsworth left the band, and Terry Bozzio came in for the Danger Money album, and that album had a huge impact on me, really progressive drumming. And obviously the stuff that Terry did with Frank Zappa had a huge impact on me. Zappa is one of my biggest musical heroes, and I love everything that Zappa did throughout his whole career, but his period with Terry Bozzio were probably some of my favorite albums. The Chic Your Booty album and Live in New York, Zoot Allures, the stuff that Terry did with Frank was just mind-blowing. And even though Neil Peart and Bill Bruford introduced me to like odd time signatures, it was Terry Bozzio and Frank Zappa's music that introduced me to like crazy polyrhythms. The stuff with Zappa, the stuff with UK, the first Missing Persons album, I loved that. The drumming on that album was tremendous. And everything Terry's done through the years in the drum community in terms of clinics and drum videos and stuff, he just continued to push what drumming can be and still does to this day. Getting away from the more prog stuff, and this guy was more of a mainstream drummer. You'd hear his band on the radio all the time in the 80s. He elevated their music to another level in terms of drumming, and I'm talking about Stuart Copeland and the music he made with the Police. Of all the guys that are on my list, most of the people on my list have this incredible discography of dozens of records, whereas Stuart Copeland and the Police really only made 5 albums. Those 5 albums, the drumming on all 5 of them is just absolutely top notch. Stuart played with such finesse, his hi-hat work, his splash work. It didn't matter if it was a simple radio song, Every Breath You Take on the radio or whatever, any of those songs from any of those albums that were big radio hits. The drumming has so much personality. It couldn't be any other drummer playing those drum parts. Stuart had such a signature style and sound and added so much musicality to the drumming of all of those songs. And, still to this day, I could listen to any of those albums and just be blown away. There was a lot of drummers in the late 70s that came around before metal got too fast, too thrashy. You had guys like Cozy Powell and Simon Phillips playing on Judas Priest and Michael Schenker's albums. And, these great hard rock drummers, there's so many I could list. Clive Burr, Ian Pace, Bill Ward. But the guy I have to put on this list as having the biggest influence of me, of that group of guys, would be Alex Van Halen. He was playing a big, massive kit, double bass kit. His double bass drumming was incredible. The drumming on the first 4 or 5, even 6 Van Halen albums, all the early David Lee Roth albums, the drumming on every one of those albums is incredible and had a huge influence on me. And my first band that I was playing with when I was a teenager, we did all Van Halen covers. I remember when MTV first started seeing those Van Halen videos, I guess they put out a bunch of live videos from the Fair Warning tour. They had Unchained, I think Hear About It Later, So This Is Love. The MTV played those all the time, and I just was like blown away by watching Alex playing. And I think another thing that was important about Alex Van Halen is the drummer-guitar player relationship. The relationship that Eddie and Alex had is something I could relate to. All the years in Dream Theater, my relationship with John Petrucci was very similar. And a lot of my favorite rhythm sections were guitar and drum rhythm sections. Alex and Eddie Van Halen, James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich, Vinnie Paul and Dimebag, that is a relationship that I could relate to. I had that in Dream Theater with John Petrucci as well. Number 9, talking about the guitar player drummer relationship, like I just mentioned with Alex Van Halen and Eddie Van Halen. Well, around 1983, I heard Kill 'Em All, Metallica's Kill 'Em All, and Lars Ulrich turned my world upside down. I can't state enough how much of an impact he had on me. And a lot of, he takes a beating in the drum world. A lot of drummers like to talk bad about him, talk slack about him, but I disagree. I think Lars is so tremendously important to the drum world. He was the type of drummer that I admired, that was like the leader of his band. He was the spokesman of his band. He was, you could tell that he was behind the songwriting and the producing and the merchandise and all that stuff. And the way he led Metallica, and still does to this day, was something that had a huge, huge impact on me. When I was coming up with Dream Theater, I kind of, wanted to be that type of drummer that had your hands on everything and, had control over what you were doing. His drumming was groundbreaking. The drumming on Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets and Justice for All, the first 4, the drumming on those albums had a huge, huge impact on me and still does to this day. And I can't state how important he is to drumming and the metal world in general. It's funny, before doing this interview, I watched Charlie Benante's top 11 picks, and it's incredible how similar our lists are. But one drummer that was not on Charlie's list was Charlie Benante, but he's on my list. Metallica, Anthrax, Slayer, Megadeth, Flotsam and Jetsam, Overkill, Nuclear Assault. I was listening to all that stuff, and it was really had a huge, huge impact on me. And Charlie was one of my favorite drummers of all these guys. Maybe it was because I was a New Yorker. I could really relate to Anthrax. So they would play L'Amour all the time. I'd see them in those early days. I could tell that he, had similar influences to me. He had similar interests as I do, the TV shows he would talk about, or the movies he would talk about, or, things like that. I just felt a very special kinship with his background and his style. And maybe that's why he and I have become such good friends through the years. He's actually one of my best friends, and he's somebody that I could just literally text every day to talk about the Beatles or talk about Iron Maiden or whatever, But his drumming, talking about his drumming, it was just, he took that speed metal thing, but he played with such precision. He really was a precise player. And the drumming, especially on Among the Living, that album was just tremendous. And also I should mention his drumming with SOD, the Speak English or Die album, had a huge impact on me. I loved that album because it was a crossover of all the stuff I was listening to. I was listening to all the thrash metal stuff, but I was also listening to the New York hardcore scene at that time. I was listening to the Crumbsuckers and Cro-Mags and Ludachrist and Leeway, Agnostic Front. So SOD kind of took the thrash metal stuff and the New York hardcore stuff I was listening to and put it all together, and I loved the SOD album. And last but not least, this on the list that goes to 11. I can't talk about Lars and Charlie without talking about Dave Lombardo. I was listening to Slayer back in the early days when they came around. The first couple albums, I loved Show No Mercy and Hell Awaits, but it wasn't until Rain and Blood that the sound and the production went to the next level. You could always appreciate Dave's drumming on those first few albums, but once you heard Rick Rubin's production on Rain and Blood, it actually was the first time that Dave sounded so clean and precise and crisp and pristine, and you know, the holy trinity, the unholy trinity, I should say, of Rain and Blood, South of Heaven, and Seasons in the Abyss. Those three albums just had such a huge impact on my drumming at that time in the mid 80s. Dave on those albums especially, but also the fact that he, through the years, has blossomed into somebody that has played with so many different bands. I could relate to that. Dave's versatility, the fact that he could play like stuff with like John Zorn and do like Phantomos music, or do really, you know, experimental things in addition to the thrash stuff he does. I have so much respect for that he can do that, and he's kind of such a versatile drummer. It's not just thrash metal. He does all these different things, and I totally admire that about him. I recommend you to check out everybody that's out there these days. A lot of modern, great drummers as well. But this list, my top 11 are the guys that had a huge impact on me when I was developing my style and career. But tell me some of your favorites. List them in the comments below. Love to see who your top 11 would be. And thanks to Revolver for having me for this. It was a lot of fun.